I just want to add one other thing in connection with the connection between insects and food. I think sometimes it's possible to think about insects as peripheral, but I think of the health of insects in the way that we think about blood pressure and weight as indications of bodily health. And when certain indicators are off, that means that your core health is off. And I think if we want to have farming that produces really healthy food, that's good for rural communities in the long term, that's good for families, that's good for the land, an indicator is how insects are doing. And so I think that's super important. I know that Gabe Brown, a regenerative farmer in North Dakota, talked about how when he was farming the conventional ways, he woke up every morning trying to figure out how to kill things. And when he transitioned to regenerative farming, he wakes up every morning thinking about how he can bring more life. And speaking of bringing more life, I think that's what our speaker, Dr. Jonathan Lundgren, is after. After a 11-year career with the USDA as one of their top scientists, he launched the Ecdysis Foundation and Blue Dasher Farm in South Dakota, where he says there are very many long, straight roads. And he's been with his team at the foundation, at the farm. They've been working to sort of really understand farming and insects, productivity, and how those can sort of be relatively harmoniously connected, and how that information can be practically shared with farmers and farmland owners. What strikes me about Dr. Lundgren that's really unique about him is a combination of prolific research, passionate love for insects and for insect life, a really strong attention to the interrelationship between things, not just one particular organism, but connections between different organisms, even between the biotic health of the insect stomachs. He thinks about all the different angles and how everything is really interconnected. And above all, he wants to make things understandable and applicable by farmers and farmland owners. And I think you'll hear about that when he speaks today. He got his start, I'm happy to say, in Illinois. I think he got his PhD in entomology from the University of Illinois. I think it was in 2004. We're glad to have him back virtually. I'm going to hand it over to you. Thanks, Dr. Lundgren.
Thank you very much, you guys, for all of that introduction. That was a nice one. I'm going to share my screen here so you guys can all see it. Can you guys see that all right?
Yep.
Okay. So we're going to, yeah, lots of information there kind of leading up to this topic of or this discussion. So I'm an entomologist, but I'm also an agroecologist. And been working, more and more with folks in Illinois. There's some really good things happening on the regenerative agriculture front. I'm also a farmer. I'm also a beekeeper, okay? And that's one of the ways that Ecdysis and Blue Dasher Farm are a little bit different than other research institutions, is that the scientists have to be farmers. That really shapes our dialogue, that shapes the kinds of questions that we ask, and it also shapes how we approach our science. So you're going to see some of that science here today, and then on Thursday, and we'll be talking a lot more about this idea of regenerative agriculture, okay, and what that all means. But to begin, we're going to talk about this insect apocalypse. Let's see. Got up in front of the National Bee Meeting, honeybees, right? The insect collapse, the pollinator crisis that we're facing right now. This was 2016, something around there. And I asked them, when did your bees start dying? And they, 2006, 2008, right in that area. I said, great. How much money have we spent on researching the bee die-off? Looks around the room, millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars. And I said, okay, how'd your bees do last year? And the room got real quiet because we've lost just as many bees back in 2008 as we do today. The way we're applying our funding, the way we're conducting our science if we make this a bee problem, we've lost before we've begun, because this isn't a bee problem, right? This is not a bee problem. This is much bigger than a bee problem. Are the insects dying? Yeah, they are. We heard tales told of this in the introduction. A study came out in 2017. There was a sister study, I think, on Lepidoptera, butterflies, that came out of Britain at the same time as this one. But essentially, we've lost about 70% of the insect biomass over the last 27 years. Insect life is quickly disappearing, okay? But it's really important to note that this isn't just insects. I mean, this is biodiversity that we're losing. We are currently experiencing the worst mass extinction event that planet Earth has ever experienced. This is worse than when the dinosaurs, were hit by the meteorite, so many millions of years ago. We're losing species at an alarming rate, and a part of that is because we're losing habitats, right? I lived in Illinois. I saw all that drainage tile, right? Farming wetlands. Where'd the wetlands go? I saw the prairie being dug up, tilled up, and put into marginal cropland. Where'd the prairie go? I think we're down to 1% of the original prairie. This picture actually was taken at Richardson Wildlife Center in near Amboy, Illinois, where they're restoring some of that prairie. Beautiful place. We're losing butterflies, we're losing birds, we're losing bats, we're losing bees. This is a major extinction event that's going on. What's causing it? A good friend of mine, Chris Vekus, and one of his colleagues wrote this paper that kind of discussed that. What is driving the insect apocalypse? And land use change, climate change, pollution, invasive species all contribute, right? I would argue that all of these these drivers that are identified are sort of a symptom. I think that the central issue, or one that we certainly have control over, is right here. The central problem that's driving the insect apocalypse is not soybeans, okay? It's not soybeans, it's how we produce our soybeans. But being that farming has a major role to change in things like climate change, in things like pollution, in things like land use, invasive species management, farmland has a tremendous opportunity to help offset these problems, okay? What am I thinking about? What am I saying when we say agriculture has become too simplified? Monocultures. Simplification is when you eliminate a lot of the species from a habitat, a lot of the life from the habitat, and you replace it with a single species. That could be a cow, that could be a wheat plant, that could be a corn plant, that could be a soybean plant. But when you monocrop, when you have these monocultures, what happens is that a lot of your goal is eliminating the life from your farm. The problem with eliminating life from your farm is that that life does things. And so biodiversity isn't just great because we love species, it's great because it drives the productivity of your farm. When you eliminate that life, you have to replace it. You have to replace it with a jug. And it doesn't matter what's on the side of that jug. All of it is intended to replace the life that you've just eliminated from your farm. Herbicides, fungicides, insecticides, fertilizers. all of these things life does for you if you're farming with a regenerative mindset. The more you use these agrochemicals, these jugs to replace life, the more you need them, because each of these things further reduces biodiversity on your farm. And so there becomes this addiction scenario, right? You get on this treadmill. There's a lot of money being made off of farming right now, but it's not by the farmers. It's usually by the jug salesman. So really what we're experiencing with this insect apocalypse is a major evolutionary event. We are selecting for species that can survive within our agricultural matrix. And not all of them are going to be able to, including us, okay? There's a lot of human health problems that we just haven't seen before. But that also means that because if we identify that as a problem area, then that also means that we have a tremendous opportunity. And the introduction kind of by Ed kind of hit on this, is that farmers suddenly have the opportunity as land managers to really make a major impact on something much bigger than their own farm. All right, why don't we stop there? Ed, you wanted me to kind of introduce certain topics and then we can open them up a little bit for discussion, but that's a big one. Do people have questions or thoughts about the insect apocalypse, life, yeah, and where life is going?
Yeah, if you want to use the chat function for any questions, that'd be helpful.
That means I have to stop sharing my screen, doesn't it?
No, it doesn't. I can see the chat without. You can keep sharing your screen.
Okay. Anybody have any thoughts or questions about that?
So I guess I have a question, Jonathan. I know, to what degree is agriculture a driver in insect apocalypse? I mean, I know there's lots of other factors like you mentioned on that one slide. To what degree is agriculture a driver for this?
I think it's one of the primary drivers. Insecticide use, fungicide use, herbicide use, all of these have direct impacts on insect life. And then we see that the correlations between insect die-offs and our agrochemical use tend to be very, very strongly correlated. Things like seed treatments are directly related to the bee collapse. So neonicotinoids, fungicides on your corn and soybean seeds, all those are really toxic chemicals. There isn't a lot of them on there, but a little goes a long way. Climates are changing, but a lot of that is because, or at least can be offset by the way that we manage the land. I mean, the planet used to regulate its climate based on life, on this little skin on the surface of the planet. When we devoted 34% of the terrestrial land surface of our planet, or of our planet to food production, we changed the capabilities of that land for offsetting things like climate regulation and things like that. So a lot of these are knock-on interactions, but also gives us tremendous opportunities too. So if we can figure out a way to farm in ways that promotes our natural resource base and keeps farms resilient and profitable, then suddenly we've got this win-win situation.
Got it. Is there anything uniquely, and I would love to keep, after my question, I'd love to keep rolling because we don't have any questions in the chat, but is there anything uniquely negative about the American approach to conventional farming, or is it just sort of a worldwide approach?
Yeah, I think that the scale I mean, you see this in Canada, you see this in Australia. You do see it in Europe as well, but they tend to be a little bit more partitioned. But the scale of farming and the scale of monoculture production is particularly has a large disproportional impact. So,
Got it.
yeah.
All right. Well, why don't we keep rolling?
Okay. So I'm an entomologist by training, right? I studied insects for a living, and entomology and pest management. I mean, the idea is that you cannot avoid insect pests. You are going to have pest problems in your field, and so you better be ready for them. Right? You can count them. It's best to count them as often as you can, and then when they reach a certain threshold, that means that they're going to start costing you money, and you better spray something. And so this is kind of what I was taught in entomology school. This is, you know, practically how we approach entomology within farmland. But then I met a growing number of farmers. And these farmers were telling me, no, we're growing, you know, the same crops as everybody else, but we don't have insect pest problems. I'm like, that doesn't sound right. You're supposed to, and you're not using any insecticides. And they're like, no, we haven't used it for years. And so I'd start to go out and look at these fields, and they were right. They didn't have pest problems. What they were doing was introducing an entirely new approach to agriculture that now is, and they didn't know it at the time. I don't think anybody knew it at the time, but now it's being branded as regenerative agriculture. And that is when I personally decided, you know what, I'm one of the top scientists within USDA. I see this as the future of food systems. These farmers are as profitable, if not more profitable, than their neighbors, and they don't have pest problems. That makes a lot of sense. And so we really need to be investing in this. The USDA wasn't interested in that, and so I quit. This needed to be a grassroots effort, and we needed science to help support this movement that's going on right now in regenerative agriculture. What does regenerative ag do? It focuses on outcomes, right? So these are two outcomes: a profit and nutritious food, right? Yields. This is typically what farmers focus on. You want money and you want yield. But what regenerative agriculture does is it changes that dialogue. And it focuses things on soil health and biodiversity. It focuses the operation, the priorities. And by focusing on soil health and biodiversity, what they find is that the profit and yields end up going up, or at least the nutrition of the food ends up going up too. And so it's a little bit counterintuitive, right? I mean, you're supposed to be focusing on those things that you can share with the neighbors. And what they can see in the drive-by of your field is big, juicy corn plants, right? But what these guys are saying is no, if we've got soil organic matter and water infiltration and things like this, plus if we have a lot of insects in our farm, that leads to greater financial security. And so that's kind of the basis of what regenerative ag is. What they try to do is they promote soil health and biodiversity. By doing that, they're reducing disturbance in order to do this on their farm. What are some disturbances? Things like tillage, things like agrochemicals. Those are disturbances from an ecological sense. And then they increase diversity, biodiversity. Plants, microbes, that's bacteria, that's fungi, animals, different revenue streams on a farm. So diversity comes in many senses, culturally as well. The practices that are used on regenerative farms are much different from each other. They can be different from each other. What unifies regenerative agriculture are certain principles. And these principles, no matter what environment you work in, when you adhere to these principles and use practices that uphold these principles, it works. We've done studies now across the country, and the consistency in the results have been really amazing to us. Principle number 1, stop tilling the soil. That doesn't mean, you know, I mean, if you're in like an intense vegetable production system, that, you know, with tubers or root vegetables or something, there's some things to confront. The vast majority of cropland should not be tilled, ever. There's no reason for that. Number 2 principle, always have living roots in the ground. Do not leave bare soil. If you see black, something is wrong with your field, and you're going to have pest problems, and you're not going to be as profitable. Number 3 principle is maximize your plant diversity using agronomically feasible ways. Okay. And then finally, integrate crops and livestock. Livestock are an essential part of a farm. They're a tool, an additional revenue stream, and all of these principles, from an ecological sense, have tremendous impact on insect communities. Okay? And so that's what I would like to spend the rest of my talk kind of explaining. Do we have any questions or thoughts or concerns at this point?
We have a question. Is fire counted as a disturbance?
That's interesting.
And what effects on insect communities are coming from fire?
Yeah, what a great point. So fire is a disturbance, and okay. All right, so not all disturbance is bad. And so when I get up and I present for farmers that are, you know, heavy tillers and stuff, I mean, the messaging is very clear. Stop. Disturbance bad. And it wasn't until my graduate students and I were talking about this that it became clear, you know what? That would lead to a late successional community in your farmland, and that reduces diversity as well. And so some disturbance is actually really important. And fire is one of those disturbances. It's a punctuated disturbance. I do not think that anybody should use it on their entire farm all at once. But the land in the prairie states, and Illinois especially, is well adapted for this. Blue Dasher Farm, we burn it once every 3 years, different fields of it, different components of it. So we have this rotational fire that we use as one of our tools. But yeah, what a great point. Another great disturbance out there, pigs. Boy, nothing prepares a seed bed quite like a pig does. But that's different than, you know, disking an entire field or disking an entire farm. Those are much different processes. Fire happens to be pretty well adapted for our environment.
So Dr. Lundgren, we were talking before about the apocalypse and that taking away essential kind of workers in the farm system. Can you give me an example like of a particular insect or group of insects or different things where if you take them out of the system, your soil system or something else kind of goes out of whack?
Dung beetles. Dung beetles are valued at, I think, oh geez, I've got the numbers. It's $380 million a year. I may be off on that. I'm just reciting that from memory, but I'm not too far off on that. If you are using porons or ivermectins of any sort, ivermect, whatever, and you're eliminating your dung beetle fauna, it's costing you a lot of money. Those dung beetles are essential for for recycling nutrients back down into the soil, for removing those paths and making the pasture available to the cows to eat. They're critical for regulating parasite levels within your animals, just a really important component. And when you conduct practices that eliminate those from your system, it hurts you. And we're documenting that in rangelands right now.
Got it. Okay, I think that's all the questions we have. You can keep moving.
Okay. All right, so let's go through these different principles. This is California agriculture too often. If you've ever been in the Central Valley, there's a reason they're having so many water issues, and you're looking at it right there. We've known that tillage has a profound effect on soil health and biology on farmland for 100 years. If you haven't read Plowman's Folly, you should give that a good read. It was written back in 1943 and a wonderful book. And he nails it. It's just as pertinent today as it was back then. One of the differences, though, is that we have a lot more no-till technology than they had back in the 40s. And so we were able to seed into undisturbed beds like that. But he really pins this down pretty well. There it is, easier. Why do farmers till? The perceptions are, well, it's going to let me get into that field a little bit earlier. It's going to be, you're going to get better seed to soil contact, and so your germination is going to be up. You know, it's going to dry it out so that I can get in there a little bit earlier. Got to kill those weeds off, and you have to kill all of your soil pests, right? So tillage makes a lot of sense. All of these are systematically disproved back in the 1940s by Edward Faulkner. And there's very little data to suggest otherwise even today. Tillage affects the soil physical properties and the structure of soils, okay? What you're after in your soil, when you take a spade out and you dig up a clod of soil, it should look like cake batter. It should look like this one on the left. If you're tilling, you're killing a lot of the life and the productivity of your soil. And then it starts to look like this one on the right. You start to see plating. The water can't get in. It just hits it and goes off. The life can't get into the soil anymore. So your biology of that soil and the fertility of your soil goes down. And you have to replace that. It increases erosion, reduces water infiltration, and then especially reduces the soil organic matter. And that's life, okay? If you've never read the book by David Montgomery called Dirt, you should. It's a really, really comprehensive one. It was one of his first books. David Montgomery is becoming a pretty prolific author, and he's also a good friend. But he's an excellent writer, and Dirt was one that really got my attention the amount of research that he's done is pretty amazing. You know, the erosion of soil, every time there's a civilization downfall from, the Sumerians to the Romans to you name it, there's always this period where they've basically destroyed their soil, and that this contributes to their downfall. Right now, agriculture is losing about 4 millimeters of topsoil per year, and 16 inches of that in the last century. The United Nations and FAO are saying that we have about, I don't know, now it's probably closer to 50 years of topsoil left on Earth. That's a crisis, okay? That's a crisis. Okay, so if tillage gets rid of that soil structure and reduces soil organic matter, how on earth are you supposed to rebuild that? Well, you do it with life. You do it with life. earthworms, biology. Charles Darwin, of all people, was one of the first people who really described this really well. He watched the worms in his backyard, and he quantified the amount of soil that that worms produce, and determined, you know what? I mean, healthy soil is essentially insect poop. We've done the numbers. There's about up to 1 billion insects, 500,000 worms per acre in South Dakota cropland. As such, you know, if we're trying to build carbon, insects are a major part of that carbon, aren't they? But, and this is the insidious part of tillage, the tillage not only destroys the physical and chemical structure of the soil, but it also kills the biology that's needed to replace that. All right, and so that is a huge reason why tillage is so evil. We looked at species richness. This was done by Ryan Schmid, one of my master's students who's now a scientist with Ecdysis Foundation. And he looked at a number of insect species that lived in cornfields, in pastures, and in prairies. And we see that these tilled cornfields have just had the life eliminated from them. There was about 25% of the life in these cornfields that was in the prairie that the cornfields replaced. Without that life, the productivity of the system stops. We need to get that life back in the soil. So there's that perception that tillage is used for pest control. This review article that was written back in 1990 was just revised and improved, and the conclusions are functionally the same. This last year it was done by John Tooker and one of his graduate students at Penn State. But essentially the same pattern came to light. 72% of all scientific research showed that tillage had no effects on any soil insect pests, or actually increased the pest's abundance instead of controlling them. Tillage is a pretty bad deal. Also, conservation tillage increases worm abundance. If worms are the source of organic matter in your soil, it increases that worm abundance by 130%, but then also the worms are bigger too. And so that's really important.
Hey, Jonathan, can you define conservation tillage?
In this paper, it was essentially no-till, but I think that they might have also included like chisel tillage or something along those lines, yeah, so just reduced forms of breaking up the soil.
Okay.
But essentially, it's no-till.
Okay.
Practically. All right. I spent a lot of time on tillage. Does anybody have questions about that? What that means for life on your farm?
I am not seeing many questions there about that.
Okay. So a lot of times when we talk about regenerative agricultural systems and pest management within them, we say, okay, this is, you know, this is what a regenerative system looks like. These are the components, you know, no-till, plant biology, and people are like, okay, I'm going to try this regenerative ag thing. I'm gonna go no-till. And it's like, no. If you just go no-till, the chances are that you might fail. Certainly no-till can work on its own. It works a lot better with the other components of a regenerative system. And the next component of that regenerative system is never leave bare soil. Okay.
Jonathan,
yeah.
Can I jump in real quick? I got
Sure.
2 questions about tillage. One is, are there any differences in impact based on the depth of tillage? And is vertical tillage considered conservation tillage?
No-till is the goal, okay? So strip tilling, vertical tillage, these sorts of things still break up the soil. They still kill soil life. They are not the goal, okay? This is not the end that you should be seeking. It is stopping tillage, getting rid of the tillage equipment so that you're not tempted to use it.
Okay.
The depth of tillage, no, it does not matter. Most of the life on your farm is within the first couple of inches of the soil surface. From there, you start to see the tunnels and the highway system kind of come into play. But if you disturb that top crust, that's where things start breaking down. As entomologists, I don't even bother sampling below around 4 inches because there just isn't anything that we catch very often.
I guess along those lines, when we think of insect life, we typically think of insect life above the ground. Is there a significant amount of insect life underground? Because we think of like bacteria and fungi. To what degree does insect life underground impact soil health?
Insect life underground is, I mean, we've got the numbers on that. If I was to just punt without looking at the data, I would say life under the soil is about 75% of all species that we end up finding in the cropland.
Wow.
Yeah, so you have a tremendous biodiversity in your soils. We're some of the only groups in the world that are doing a lot of these comprehensive bioinventories of agroecosystems. We've identified literally thousands of species from croplands and rangelands from around the U.S., trying to develop a library or a collection of all of these different things so that we can monitor things like change. And we've got data from bioinventories from the foliar communities of corn from the last 10 years or so every year, and we've watched those insect communities decline.
Huh. So could you have soil health without healthy insects, sort of underground insect populations?
No, insects are an essential part of that whole system. So you don't get soil health without insects, and you don't have insects without soil health. So that's really, it's kind of a circular thing.
And here's another question before you get into the bare soil. What are the best methods for reducing herbicides if you stop tillage?
Okay, so on our farm, we don't use tillage and we don't use herbicides. We use fire, we use grazing, and we use competition, cover crops and things like that. But every time you till, you bring up a whole new crop of weed seeds. And so it ends up exacerbating weed problems when you start to till. Herbicides do the same thing. They tend to select for species that are really well adapted to living with herbicides. And so they make weed problems. Yeah, so those are some of the tools that we use. If you've eliminated livestock from your system, you're eliminating a major tool. I had a group of farmers out visiting, and they were like, well, I see a lot of weeds out here. And I kind of went like that. I'm like, I don't see any weeds. I see forage. Why would I spend money on controlling a plant community that I can turn into in our case, lamb? We graze it with sheep. So
got it.
Look at problems as opportunities.
Yep, good to go.
All right. So never leave bare soil. Going no-till is not enough. You've got to cover that soil. Cover crops, huge benefits to the soil and to insect life just by including cover crops into your rotation. Why is this so important? Because that plant cover protects the soil. And then the roots of it and the foliage and all of the different parts of those cover crops, those end up supporting a lot of life on your farm. And so without that, if you have a desert out there, no life can survive. You have to have plants. Why do farmers keep bare soil? Well, those cover crops, they use up a lot of water. We got to be careful of that, and so we don't want to compete the crop either. I mean, if we've got the cover crop down there, then how's our cash crop going to get up and over it? And those cover crops, you know, I mean, we got a lot of armyworms now that we started using cover crops. And then how do I get them in there? How do I get them out of there? It's just not worth it. Those would be some of the reasons that I've heard. Too hot, too dry, too wet, too cold. That may work on your farm, but it'll never work here. It can't work on my farm. I hear that wherever it is that I've gone, and I've always found farmers that were bold enough to challenge that, and they've made it work, okay? So you've got to change your mindset. Otherwise, cover crops won't work. I guarantee it. But they're essential. They're essential to your farm staying in business. Okay. Plant covers, they retain your soil, they build soil organic matter, they increase water infiltration so that the water doesn't end up forming pools on the top and you can get into your fields. Reduces the bulk density of your fields so that those crops end up getting a leg up. Okay. So many different benefits to the soil of having that armor on the surface. Where does the energy come from that your farm uses? I think that's a really important question we need to ask ourselves. A lot of people answer that with, oh, a diesel can. Like, no, that's not the right answer. The right answer is the energy that drives the whole farm comes from the sun. And there's only one way to catch that energy, and that's with plants, okay? So we have to be capturing energy from the sun as much of the year as we possibly can, because that drives the whole productivity of your farm. The biology needs that energy, okay? We did a project, and this was my first cover crop project ever, and I didn't know what the heck I was doing, okay? But it still seemed to work out pretty well. This was done back in 2009 and 2010. And what we did is we just had a single spring planted cover crop. And it was just one species, slender wheatgrass, which is a native grass up in our area. And we wanted to see what happened with corn rootworms, which is a beetle pest of corn. Some of you may remember. You guys may have some resurgence in some of these rootworm pests. Illinois was kind of a hotbed of that. Essentially, the corn rootworm is a beetle. The larvae live on the soil, in the roots of the plants, and they make it a lot more difficult for that plant to be harvested and then reduce yields. So we infested these things. We wanted to compare this over a couple of years with bare soil, just leaving that soil bare. And so we took out our handy dandy corn rootworm egg infester and we injected 1,000 corn rootworm eggs per row foot. We really wanted to test these two systems. And then we went out and we sucked up everything on the soil surface. And then we looked at these caterpillars and we put, boy, that video is kind of distorted, but we looked at these caterpillars and we put a pin through their butts and we pinned them out in the field, and then we would see what predators would kind of come out and eat them. And so we did that during the day and during the middle of the night. Cornfields are creepy places in the middle of the night. So this is what we were finding. Let's see. So I'm sorry, this was done in 2007, 2008. Oh my gosh, I was young. Cover crops are the black bars. Gray bars are bare soil. And this is the number of predators that we were finding out there. Look at how many more predators there were in these cover crop fields. And this was just, all we did was plant this thing in this early, either in the winter or first thing in the spring, as soon as we had thaw. And then we killed it with an herbicide right before planting corn into it. I would do it much differently now if I had a do-over, but I learned a lot from this, okay? Look at all of these predators that were in these cornfields as a result of just having that residue of a single species out on those fields. Tremendous impact on predator populations. And predators of the corn rootworm, what I'm referring to here are things like ants and carabid beetles, like this bad boy sitting in the picture there, crickets, centipedes, spiders, things like that. These were the effects on corn rootworms. And the first, these are the baby, these are all immature stages of the rootworm, so these are the larvae. First instars are just hatchlings, there was no difference. Second instars, these are kind of teenagers, I guess you would call them, and there was no difference. But then as they got older and they got a little more, they got larger, they needed more root tissue. And so what we see is we see a 67% reduction in the corn rootworms during this, in the cover crop fields. So what we think is happening here, and then the crop damage was significantly reduced as a result of reducing those third instars by the cover crops, okay? We think what was going on here is that the rootworms were living in the corn roots, and then, but the cover crop changed the root structure of those plants and forced the corn rootworm larvae out of the corn roots where there was increased levels of predators out there. So the predators then were able to eat the corn rootworms. Very, you know, nature works in complex ways that aren't always easy to partition out and understand as a scientist. And so in this case, I think that that's how those cover crops were working. But because we were reducing these, the rootworm damage so much, we actually can replace the cost of BT corn seed simply by having a cover crop beforehand. Any questions about that?
I have two questions, I guess. One is, I graze a variety of animals, but none seem to eat thistle. What is the best way to clear out thistle the animals leave behind without using chemicals?
Yeah, so we had a big thistle problem on our farm, and we farm within the prairie, and so thistles tend to be really disturbance prone. And so if you're grazing with a single livestock species, that can contribute to thistle problems. It's nice to integrate herds, and we'll kind of talk about that in a little bit. Getting competition onto Blue Dasher has been essential. And so our thistle problem has gone down every year as a result of us establishing perennial warm season competitors that can outstrip those thistles. So we allow the thistle to flower because I've got 160 beehives and thistles are a great bee plant. And then we snip the heads off and we mow them down a little bit and follow with a seeding of perennial warm season grasses again, prairie species whenever possible.
Very good. Then regarding cover crops, do you feel that focusing on feeding the soil biology when first going to no-till via cover crops and humic materials will speed up the change in the soil health? Absolutely.
1000% that is true. We're studying transition strategies of major cash grain systems from Manitoba all the way down to Kansas right now. And so we'll have a better picture of exactly which combination of practices seems to juice that system the fastest and is the most profitable approach. But we've got another year or two on that study. So we'll be able to give a little bit clearer advice, but certainly don't go no-till unless you've got cover crops in there and something to help jazz up the life and redistribute the life within that farm.
Got it. And another question, I guess it's just as my own, from reading some of your work and hearing some of your presentations, you've talked about how, I guess getting back to the whole use of chemicals and not having cover, when people try to eliminate insects, they often end up with more pest insects with less, when they don't have diversity, they have more pest insects than when they do. I think you understand where I'm going. Can you sort of say just a little more about that?
Sure. What makes a pest problem is a fundamental question that we have been working on for around 5-6 years now. It's a lack of insect diversity. And so insect diversity is what keeps pests low. We've demonstrated this in a lot of different systems now. The only way you get insect diversity, so what ends up happening when you use an insecticide is that you eliminate the diversity of your insect community, and the pests end up being fairly tolerant or become very tolerant or resistant even to the pesticide. And so you create this just perfect environment for pest proliferation. There's no biotic resistance to those pests so they can just go crazy in your fields. So the only way to get over that is by stopping. That's real hard. Oh my gosh, that's hard.
Good. And then I've got, okay, and actually, can you just, again, we have landowners in the audience. Can you just define what humic materials are?
Compost, things like this, things that would, compost teas would be another example, ground covers that would break down, that would be cover crop residue possibly. So all of those, I don't know, I think all of those you could make a case for being humic materials.
Got it. And then before I let you get going on with principle number 3, I just want to let people know that Mike Bredesen, who's one of your colleagues, will be giving us a webinar in July about the relationship between cover crops and insects, and I think in greater depth. So go ahead.
Yep, and he's a great speaker. You guys don't want to miss him.
All right.
Okay, so the third principle, so we got eliminate tillage, never leave bare soil. Now we're talking about how do we diversify our insect communities, okay? Diversify our plant communities in ways that are agronomically feasible. Why would you want more plant diversity on your farm? The reasons end up being because biodiversity, almost every other group of organisms, their diversity scales directly with how many plant species are within a habitat. And so there's been a few studies that have been done that show that you need at least 10 to 16 species of plants in things like cover mixes before you start to see certain ecosystem services like carbon sequestration or invasive species resistance and things like that in your fields. And so that's a lot more than just a rye cover crop, right? But if that's your first step, you know, we all need a gateway drug, and so understand that that's a great first step. There's more to do. So we need plant diversity. Why? Because biodiversity, again, that's the source of everything in your farm, right? That's the source of productivity. It makes soil. Life makes soil. It incorporates residue. And so you're able to get your crops in. It increases seed set by having pollinators out there. Even self-fertilized plants like soybeans and sunflowers, experience a yield bump, sometimes up to 20%, just by having beehives next to your fields. There is no cheaper way. I mean, you actually make money off of this if you play your cards right by having to increase yields of your crops than having honeybees nearby. These things suppress crop pathogens. Life suppresses crop pathogens. It improves your water relationships with the soil. And then it manages your insect pests. I mean, nature, predators and parasitoids are nature's insecticides. And they're trying to do a job, but you gotta give them a shot. So that is the functions of biodiversity.
Jonathan, can you say something about crop pathogens? Are you talking about insects have some impact on crop pathogens? Oh. Jonathan? Looks like you froze up.
And the more,
There we go.
and then those land like farming should be. Let's see. Okay. So in some cases, crop rotations are, so there's a lot of ways of getting diversity out there. Plant diversity. Okay. Some of this starts even as simply as even crop diversity. Putting two different varieties of crops out there has been shown to reduce insect pests. And that works real well within your current system. Doesn't hurt you a bit. Rotations end up also being really important. So, I mean, there's ways of manipulating your crop cycles that don't disrupt your system in any way. You're already kind of built for farming this way, that don't mean necessarily, okay, I've got to put, a 20-way mix this year. So there's steps you can take if you want to incrementally go this route. Crop rotations are huge, and they work in ways that we don't understand. It's what scientists just dismiss as the rotation effect. We saw these increase in nitrogen. We can't exactly budget this out for some reason. Must be the rotation effect. We don't must. There's this black box of plant interactions and legacies of your plants or your crops and your cropping decisions that sometimes last for years on your farm. We know that this is really good for pests that are associated with residue from a particular crop. So the rootworms, for example, overwinter near corn roots, and when you plant corn in the same place the next year, those eggs end up hatching and having a ready food source. Wheat stem sawfly overwinters in wheat stems, and so they are in fields and so when you plant wheat on wheat, you're guaranteed to have a wheat stem sawfly problem every year. So there's also some evidence that things like soybean aphids might be affected by the preceding crop as well, but nobody's really understood that, because soybean aphids don't overwinter in soybeans, do they? They overwinter on things like buckthorn, and then they always have to migrate in every year to soybeans. So theoretically, crop rotations should not control soybean aphids. We wanted to compare this, and so we did that. We looked at two different rotations. So this was, we looked at spring wheat versus an oat pea mixture in year one. All right, this was spring planted and then harvested. Both of these were, and then a fall winter cover crop was established in both of these different systems. And then we burned the crop difference, but 2 crops prior, there was a difference, okay? Otherwise, the whole system was the same. Then we sampled for soybean aphids out there, and we looked at predator populations also within these soybean fields. I think I might be breaking up for some reason. Let me see if my internet is okay. It says I'm all connected.
Okay. All right. You're just freezing a few times there.
Okay. Can you get me now?
Yep, it's good.
All right. What we ended up finding over this 3-year study, the soybeans planted after springweed had up to 75% fewer soybean aphids than the soybeans that were planted after oats and peas. What would corn do? We didn't, yeah, that's the question, everybody. Why didn't you just use a nice corn-soybean rotation? Well, we don't have data on that. It would have probably been different than both of these. But it was interesting to at least document that, you know what? There's a tremendous legacy, even in these cases when the insect pest doesn't overwinter on the focal crop. We think that this was because predators were significantly more abundant in those per aphid in those spring weeds, in that spring wheat preceded soybean crop. And so the predators were up there. Is it an artifact of there being more aphids, or is there, regardless, I think it illustrates the point of biodiversity and how important that diversity is. Decisions today can have long-lasting implications for the biodiversity of your farm into the future. Any questions about plant diversity?
All right, we have one technical suggestion. If Jonathan's feed stutters again, a recommendation is to turn off his webcam. He can still use his mic and share screen. Webcam video eats a lot of bandwidth. So that's a really good. Thank you, Caitlin, for that recommendation. That's great.
Okay. Do you want me to do that, or do you want to see my gorgeous face? Nobody wants that. I'm turning it off.
All right. All right, and then we have question from Ludwig. Is it possible to have a diversified insect community in a monoculture? I guess the question there would be, if you didn't use a lot of chemicals, could you actually have a diverse insect community in a monoculture?
You will have insects in your fields. Will you have enough? That's the question. If you're starting with a monoculture, you're kind of fighting a losing battle.
Okay. And then there's another question from Michelle. Do the honeybees near the crop fields affect the population of native pollinators and insects due to their territorial nature and competition?
So this is a good question. Certainly honeybees are excellent foragers. Typically, native bees and honeybees, how to say this? Okay, are honeybees having an impact on native pollinators? Probably yes. Is agriculture having a much bigger problem or effect on native pollinators? Absolutely yes. And so if we want to pick on honeybees, we can, but really if you're supplying habitat for honeybees, you're also supplying habitat for a lot of natives. And lack of habitat is a huge critical problem, especially clean habitat. So let's build the habitat, and then we'll worry about whether or not the honeybees are hurting the natives all that much. But right now, we can't live without honeybees within our food systems. Just with the scale of agriculture and the nature of farming right now, I think the natives just aren't going to be able to kind of keep it going on their own.
Okay.
Certainly that does not mean I'm against native pollinators. Please don't read that. I'm just also not against honeybees.
Got it. All right, let's keep rolling.
Okay. So the final element, the final principle of all of this is integrating crops and livestock together. Plants and animals did not evolve in silos, okay? They interact with each other. And the soil and the plant communities, everything it hinges on whether or not you have animal integration within that system. Okay. Livestock are a huge tool, and realizing that gives you an opportunity. Personally, you know, I'm not trying to throw out any tools that don't hurt my farm, right? So I don't use herbicides, I don't use tillage, because that would kind of put me at odds with a lot of what I'm trying to do here. I also don't want to throw out animals because, you know what? I mean, yeah, there's so many things I can do with them. Not only are they an additional revenue stream because of the meat or products they produce, but they're also inherent in nutrient cycling and soil organic matter development, insect management. I mean, I make money off of my insect community because I, you know, farm honey, and I also feed my chickens and things like this, and then weed control as well. So really important. Grazing. Grazing is a huge tool for weed control. You got to do it right, though. So we keep our animals tight. We try to mimic the foraging behavior of large ruminants that used to dwell in these areas. And I raise hair sheep. I also have pastured pork, broiler, and egg layer chickens. Those are the things that we have on Blue Dasher. The mimicking that high intensity graze and then moving them and allowing that plant community to rest is really important. And then this is an area that really needs to be explored more, is integrating multiple species within a herd. Because diversity doesn't just matter in plants, diversity also matters in livestock selection and animals. Yeah, I already said this statistic, but bees are another one of those livestock, aren't they? It's actually one of the main money makers on Blue Dasher Farm is our honey sales. So yeah, great way of diversifying your revenue streams, increasing the resilience of a farm, and for managing vegetation communities. Questions about livestock?
I guess one question I had is, I think you had a chart before that showed various degrees of insect diversity based on whether it was corn monoculture, pasture versus prairie.
Mm-hmm.
How much more diversity would you have in a pasture versus sort of a conventional row crop farm?
You end up having 33%, right around there, of the diversity in a cornfield versus a pasture that's been grazed.
Okay.
So 67% more, if I'm doing my math right.
Okay. And I do have a question here. It's a kind of a specific one from someone in McHenry County. I am a regenerative farmer who still uses herbicides when needed, but does not use any seed treatments other than inoculants. I have noticed as soon as my neighbors spray their post-emergent herbicides that my winter cereal crops burst with beneficial insects.
Huh.
It almost seems to be acting as a refuge for them.
Yeah.
So the question, first of all, I think he wants to know, does that sound right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, for sure. Those insects are flocking to the last clean area in a little island. So. And
then his next question is, how far can the average non-flying insect travel in a day?
Oh, so that's a hard question to answer because there's so many different kinds of insects and they all have different behaviors. We advocate, and I actually have it written on my computer on a notepad right here of things I need to be doing, is we've done a study where we marked field margins to see how far into the field those insects go, and we're thinking it's around 150 meters or so per day is some of the statistics that I've heard.
Okay, so then this bears on his second part of his question, which is if it isn't too far, could a farmer alternatively spray every 120 feet and then come back in a few days to spray the other 120 feet? So you essentially would create strips. You create a strip of safe area next to a strip of treated area, sort of in an alternating strip system that would give your insects a place to hide and then move around. Does that make any sense?
That makes sense, and it's a possibility. The question is if you have an insect pest problem, stop reacting to the symptoms and solve the problem, okay? The problem is almost never an insect pest. The problem is poor soil health, poor diversity. If you solve those problems, then you won't have to keep your local chemical dealer so busy. You don't have to keep paying out for this stuff, okay?
Got it. All right, then we have a question. This is a long one. Many times when switching from a more conventional farming program to a regenerative farming program, you start with farm soils with issues that are in need of repair, such as pH issues, soil structure, compaction, stratification issues, drainage, etc. The upper Midwest has had a couple of very wet growing seasons, which has enhanced some of those problems. Should growers do what they can to start correcting some of these problems, even though they may require some tillage, before they dive into a regenerative farming program? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So when you get into a farm, it's not going to get better until you stop using the tools that created the problems to begin with. And tillage is one of them, okay? Plants and animals are very powerful tools, and they can solve most issues with soil. If you have a damaged, degraded farm, it took decades to produce that. It's not going to take decades to fix it, but it isn't going to happen overnight either, okay? And so figuring out ways of using that farm during that transition period, that interim period, it becomes really important. And that might mean thinking outside the box a little bit, okay? Just because they've farmed corn and beans in a particular farm for generations, chances are real good you're going to have to grow something different, okay?
We have another question. Have you used trace mineral foliar applications after livestock grazing to boost plant recovery and health? So maybe you could explain foliar applications. I know John Kempf believes that if you boost the plant health through the foliar applications, you can actually then, that's a way of actually boosting their injection of carbon and other substances into the soil, which then boosts soil health. So what do you think of trace mineral foliar applications?
I have a lot of respect for John Kemp, and he's a good friend, and so I'm not saying anything about that. But I think that, you know, our choices in agricultural practices have produced these mineral deficiencies in a lot of our crop fields. There's a reason why nutrient density in our foods has diminished by 40%. There's a reason that the nutrient density of pollen for bees in native plants has been reduced by 40% over the last several decades. We've charted that, right? A lot of that's because of these residual herbicides. A lot of that is because of these agrochemicals. A lot of that is because of tillage, where we've destroyed the microbial fauna. If you restore those things to your fields, if you restore life to your fields, then it's going to make those minerals available again. So I'd rather do this without using a jug if I can. That's not always easy though, okay? I understand that.
Have you had an experience, John, where you've seen a farmer go from very conventional practices towards regenerative? Maybe not all the way there, but reducing tillage. And has someone documented how quickly it takes for those insect populations to return?
Within the first year, you see major changes, even just by incorporating a cover crop.
Huh.
Major changes to your insect community, year one. What's been interesting is I have yet to see an asymptote, right? I have yet to see where, oh, well, you're done. You've done enough to increase biodiversity. You've hit your peak and you can't get any better than this. And so that's actually kind of exciting because there's always ways of building that diversity on your farm. And the more you do, the better off you are.
Excellent. And so again, to ask a very basic question, have farmers been surprised? Because their instinct is this is a us versus them thing. If I don't take care of the insects, they're going to take care of me in sort of in a negative way. Have you seen some farmers be surprised at what that insect response has provided in terms of productivity and actually handling the pests?
Yeah. I had a farmer in Kansas. He said, I heard you speak a year ago. And so as a result of your presentation, I dropped all of my neonics. I don't use them anymore. I'm like, okay, great. Yeah, I think that's a really important first step. I'm like, how'd things go? And he's like, well, I planted beans this year. Okay, yeah. And he's like, I had a lot of armyworms that first year. I'm like, in this first year, I'm like, oh, okay, how's it look now? He's like, well, beans look real good. You saved me $10,000 last year. So yeah, it's pretty surprising sometimes, but the payoff is very real.
And how, going back, sort of circling back to the whole insect apocalypse question, are you hopeful for what we can do with agriculture and insects? And what top 3 things would you recommend to people to sort of to turn the ship, to sort of help us have an agriculture that's more friendly to insects?
Am I hopeful? Yes, absolutely. I wake up every day knowing that we're on the right track right now. This ship of agriculture is changing, and I see the impact of our own science here in South Dakota, as well as that change starting to happen. My very conventional neighbors started using cover crops, for example. What 3 steps would I tell farmers to do? Step 1, take off your shoes and socks and walk out barefoot into a prairie, into your crop fields. Feel the connection with the land that you are responsible for. Okay? That understanding and that appreciation is going to change your entire mindset. And that's the first step. Okay? Sounds crazy. Please do it. Next step is sell your tillage equipment. And the third step is invest all of that money that you just put into tillage, or that you just got back from all your tillage equipment, into interseeder and a lot of cover crop seeds.
Got it. And then I guess from the other perspective of the landowner, suppose you're a landowner and you believe everything you've just said, John, and you've got a farmer who's like, I don't know, if this fails, I'm not going to make much money, and I'm just barely making it as it is. How do you persuade a farmer who hasn't sort of drank the ecological Kool-Aid?
Find a farmer that will, and because seeing is believing, or force your farmers to go to some of these soil health meetings. No-till on the plains is a huge one. That's a good first step. The Burley County soil health meeting up in Bismarck, North Dakota. Excellent meeting. One of the best you'll ever attend. Really strong. Start listening to John Kemp's podcast. Force your farmers to start educating themselves.
We have a question. Are most insecticides applied by seed treatments? Are the seed treatments specific to targeted pests?
So that's a good question. And it's actually kind of a challenging question. So there is a lot more acres treated with seed treatments. The quantity of insecticide is probably less on the seed treatments. The toxicity of the insecticide is far greater on the seed treatments. And so you have this strange situation where we're using less insecticide, even though we're treating greater amounts of farmland, and it's more toxic than it's ever been.
Wow. And the seed treatments aren't specific to targeted pests. Is that correct?
No, not a bit. These are broad spectrum, and they do not stay put. We'll talk about that more on Thursday.
Got it. And I guess last thing, as far as when you think about insect diversity in farm fields, what is there? Are there? We typically think about pollinators. Are there insect species or groups of insects, families of insects that we don't appreciate for what they do for farming and for productive farming that we should be paying attention to?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we don't even know what a lot of insects are doing, but we know we can't live without them. And so that's been that's a really important, that's a humbling and important point, you know? So if you see most of the insects in your fields are actually helping you, they are not hurting you. And so you can't live without them. So all of that is really important. But a lot of other species that are, oh, here we go. I got all these chats. Good. So things like lacewings, things like ants, things like crickets, these are all beneficials, okay? You need these in your fields. They're actually doing, a lot of people dismiss all those little black beetles. Those little black beetles are, up to, 100 different species in your soil and are important seed predators for your weeds, as well as insect predators for soil pests. So gotta have them.
So last question, then we'll wrap up. So taking your advice, if someone's actually walking barefoot through their farm field, is there a particular insect, if they saw that, they say, wow, I'm doing really well, or that I'm bringing things back, or are all insects just valuable and you can't really tell how well you're doing by any one particular species?
Good guys and bad guys are a totally anthropomorphic idea. The insects don't recognize that.
Okay.
Are there good indicator species? Boy, what a great question. As a result of all of these bioinventories, we'll be exploring that more. And so we'll be able to correlate some of those things. Right now, what we can say is it's not one species, it's diversity. Okay. It's the numbers.
Okay, Dr. Lundgren, thank you so much for today. Thanks everyone for attending. We are going to be creating recordings of these on YouTube that we'll be able to share eventually. I hope today was useful. The next session will be this Thursday at 11 a.m. We'll be covering more about some of the specific negative practices of conventional farming, whether it's neonics or tillage or various other things that you'll want to sort of know in terms of specifically what those negative impacts are. And then I think we'll also be looking at some other practices that Dr. Lundgren can highlight. Again, thank you for your interest. Have a great day, and we're grateful that you're interested in thoughtful farming. Have a good day.